You need to see how ridiculous this is. I feel like when Mark writes like this, it's almost comical. And there's a reason why Mark writes like this. There's a reason why Scripture is written like this, because it's supposed to make us think about it. It's supposed to grab our attention. We're not just supposed to read it and be like, oh yeah, here's a nice story that I'm going to tell my kids. It's like, what? Something crazy is happening. What is God trying to teach us through this event? Notice, in all of this, the passage from verse 1 through 20, there's one recurring theme that's going on. Okay? And our title for this message this morning was that Jesus is in the business of making the unclean clean. There's a theme that's running through this crazy story from verse 1 to verse 20, and that theme is that Jesus, like it says in the title, is in the business of making the things that are unclean clean. Okay? Now, three specific things that give us those hints. Throughout this passage, it talks about the first thing, which is the evil spirit. Now, the word evil spirit is better translated actually as the unclean spirit. And so this person that is possessed by this evil spirit, Jesus looks at, and when he says evil, he's talking about an unclean spirit that is not wholly that of God, that is inside this man. Where does this man live? He lives in the graveyard, in the place of death. In the old Jewish customs, even if you came a certain number of feet in distance and encounter with a dead body, you were ceremonially unclean, meaning that before you went into the temple of God, you had to cleanse yourself. Okay? So this man with an unclean spirit lives in an unclean place, and guess what? God takes this unclean spirit and he chases him out into where? Into the pigs. If you know the Jewish traditions, pigs were considered to be what? Unclean animals. Jesus is in this business. There's a theme that's running, and Jesus is saying, look, wherever I go, I make things that are unclean, unholy, and I transform them to be clean. That's the running theme. Okay? Now, we need to think about this, because this isn't the first time Jesus is mentioning this, and this isn't the first notion that we get where Jesus says, my business is to make the things that are unclean, clean. It happens throughout. And even in our Mark study, we see it over and over again, whether it's the person who has a leper. There's another account of the person with an evil spirit that comes to Jesus. There's another account of somebody who is sick and Jesus casts out the unclean spirit. And remember a couple chapters back, Jesus is talking about the paralyzed man and how it talks about the spirit that's inside of him and how it needs to be resurrected for God. Jesus talks about this over and over again, and he says, my job is to make the things that are unclean, clean. And he uses many different examples to tell us that. And I ask, why? Why, Jesus? Why do you use so many different stories that essentially talk about the same thing? And I believe the answer is in here. I believe that for Jesus and for God, God takes sin so much more seriously than we do. For us, when we look at things that make us, because what is unclean in the ways that the Old Testament and the New Testament teach? Being unclean literally meant that you were being separated from the presence of God, that you did not have the right to be in the presence of God. That's the definition of sin. The definition of sin is being separated from God. Okay? And so I think the reason why God keeps repeating these stories, showing us different examples of what it means to be unclean and how Jesus makes things that are unclean clean, is that he's pointing out to us, hey, we don't really understand the magnitude of how sin dirties our lives, how sin separates us from the place of God. Because you see, for some reason, we have tiers for sin. We have these sins that are more extreme, the things that we really need to watch out for, things that we're not supposed to do. And then there's the kind of like the gray area sin. Sins like white lies. You know, I had a really hard time with this because one time a youth student came up to me and they're like, Pastor Dave, I know we're never supposed to lie, but is there ever a lie that you can tell that's actually good? I'm like, I don't think so. He said, well, let me give you an example. The other day, my parents were in a fight, and you know why they got into a fight? It's because my mom asked my dad if this dress makes her look fat. And my dad has always told us not to lie, that there is no lie that can be good. And so when my mom asked that, he didn't say yes, he just paused, hesitated. So I don't know. There are these gray areas. There are things that are obvious, right? Like if you murder someone, it says, God says very clearly, you shall not murder, thou shalt not take another person's life. But it says nothing about white lies. And so when we do these things, naturally in our minds, when it comes to sin, we compartmentalize things. There are things that are definite, and then there are things that maybe it doesn't really bother Jesus too much. I think there's a reason why Jesus keeps talking about this over and over again, because for God, there is no such thing as a gray area, small or big. When Jesus says something, when God says something, it's very clear. Either do it or you don't. There is no gray area. There is no middle ground. Jesus takes sin so much more seriously than we do. And he tries to show us the gravity of that sin. In Hebrews 12:1, what Paul writes in this book, he says, hey, look, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. Okay? When he's talking about sin, and it comes over and over again, don't ever underestimate sin. Even the smallest one, don't ever underestimate it, because why? When you underestimate it, overlook it, the sin can develop into death, and death into eternal separation from God. It says, even no matter how small it is, it so easily entangles it. It's like 1,000 weeds that come up, that tangle up the motors of your life, and you don't know where it came from. You must not underestimate the power of sin. And so Jesus gives example over example to say, hey, look, I am in the business of making everything that is unclean, clean. The example that he gives us in this crazy story is a man that is enslaved by this unclean spirit, right? And I think it's amazing. I heard this example being given this past winter, and I thought it was so pertinent, because why? This pastor, he said that this is an example of how sin gets so easily overlooked, okay? Because on the outside, this man is the strongest man in the world. Physically, on the outside, this man with an unclean spirit, this man that signifies sin in our lives, on the outside, when other people look at him, he's the most strongest man in the world. Because what does it say? He lived in the tomb. No one can bind him. No one can subdue him. And even if you put chains on his hands and foot, they weren't strong enough. He broke free from them. And so when you're looking at this, he's the world's strongest man. And so physically, on the outside, people are looking at him, they're like, man, this man is so strong. But as you see in verse 5, on the outside he was looking strong and perfect. But on the inside, what was happening? Day and night he's crying out. Day and night he is cutting himself. Day and night. On the inside, this person is dying. Let me give you an example of this. I have many, many friends that are extremely, extremely successful. As soon as they got out of college, they went into iBanking or internet banking, things like that in Wall Street, and make six-figure easy. Their bonus checks are more than I make in 2 years, okay? They make tons and tons of money. These guys work 80 to 90 hours a week. They don't really go to church, and you know why? The only reason for studying their whole entire life is because they said, I need to make money because my family didn't have a lot of money and I never want to get to that place. On the outside, when I look at them and when you see the way that they live their lives, the cars that they drive, the clothes that they wear, they're very powerful, successful human beings. 28-year-old. Some of these guys are going to retire by the time they're 35. Successful. I went to go visit one of my friends. Every single time he sits down, doesn't matter where he is, he'll fall asleep. We have had to wake him up from using the bathroom more than once. He'd be sitting on the toilet and he would fall asleep. I'm not even joking to make this sound funny. Seriously. Wherever he is, the moment he gets a chance to just sit down, he'll fall asleep. And one day, we're having dinner and then he falls asleep, so we wake him up and then he starts to cry at the dinner table. And he says to us, I am so tired. I have all the money in the world, but I am never satisfied. If you underestimate sin, take a very long look at this example that Christ gives. Strong on the outside, the world may see that there's nothing wrong. but on the inside, it dies. And so when Paul and all these people warn about sin, and when Jesus gives example over example, it's saying, hey, don't underestimate it. Even the smallest one, it will come out of nowhere, it will entangle your life. You must get rid of all. You must be in the business that Jesus is in, the business of making things that are unclean, clean. And so the way that I use this term, business, is I did it on purpose. I want to say it's a business that Jesus is in because He's asking us to partner in this business of making the things that are unclean, clean. Okay? So as this intense, crazy story unfolds, Jesus takes this unclean spirit and He says, okay, I want you to go into the pigs. And all 2,000 of them, it says in our passage, they go into them, and all 2,000 of the pigs, they run into the water and they drown. Okay? Let me contextualize this a little bit. Back then, money and the value of money, possessions, was often calculated by the amount of livestock that you owned. Okay? Whether it's cows, goats, things like that. It wasn't with equity, with house, with a home, with whatever. It was with how many animals that you owed. Okay? Even when you were getting married, the wife's family, as a dowry or as a wedding payment, would give a certain amount of cows or a certain amount of livestock to the husband's family. There are certain countries in the world that are still going on with this practice. Okay, so having animals and livestock meant direct money into your account. It meant funds and equity and all those things. 2,000 pigs in today's time. Okay, 2,000 pigs in today's time. Let me give you an estimate of how much 2,000 pigs would be worth to one person. $250,000, $250,000. 2,000 pigs in today's time would be somebody losing $250,000. $250,000. Now what happens? These people that are tending these pigs just saw $250,000 run into the water and drown. And so these people, they run back to the town and they go to the owners and say, it wasn't my fault. I didn't kill $250,000 of your property. I didn't do it. There's this man that chased the evil spirit and they went into the pigs and they drowned. And what's amazing is, what do these people do? They come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, leave our area. You know what the invitation is? The invitation to this business? Jesus says, look, I'm in the business of making the people that are unclean, clean. I'm in the place of making things that are unclean, clean. Will you join me? Because His message to His disciples is, be like me. Be in this business. And He asks us, how much is a soul worth for you? Because these people, the owner, they came back, and what did they say in our passage? They saw this man sitting, dressed properly in his right mind. And after they saw that, they said, Jesus, leave. Because to them, they're not looking at the saved, transformed life. They're looking at their checkbooks, at the $250,000 that they just lost. And Jesus asks us. He says, hey, I'm in this business. Wherever I go, I make things that are unclean, clean. And it's going to cost you. How much are you willing to give up for one soul? And seeing that most of us aren't millionaires and we don't have $250,000 to lose, let me bring it down a little bit. In our day, what do they say when you watch movies, Wall Street movies or whatever? They say time is money. Right? Time is the most valuable asset that people can give. Time is money. So let me change the question a little bit. How much time are you willing to involve and invest in the saving in the business of making someone clean or making yourself clean?